The sales manager watched Kane Fisher circle the used lot for a full 10 minutes before he walked over, hands in his coat pockets, trying to look helpful while he steered her away from the new combine package parked by the service bay. Her truck had 298,000 miles on it, rust over both rear wheel wells, and a cracked mirror taped at the edge. So he pointed toward a 7-year-old machine with 3,800 separator hours and told her it would fit her budget better. Kane nodded once, asked for the exact cash price on the new package anyway, and he repeated that financing would make more sense for her operation. He had not asked what her operation was. He printed both quotes, one for the used unit and one for the new package, and slid them across the desk with the practiced patience of someone certain he already knew the ending. Used package, $346,000 before tax. New combine with 2 headers and support package, $612,000. Kane looked at the second number, asked for the wire instructions, and the manager gave a small laugh that sounded polite enough to deny later. He said he would get finance to run terms. She said she did not need terms. He still opened the finance form because that is what he had done with everyone for 20 years. Kane let him type her name, birth date, and operation name, and when he asked for the lender she used, she gave him Reed Holloway at First Prairie. The room shifted a little at that name because Reed approved few large equipment notes without collateral reviews. Kane stood up, stepped outside, and called her bank from the gravel edge of the lot. 7 minutes later, the dealership controller refreshed her screen and saw $612,000 post as an incoming wire, reference line Fisher Grain Operations Equipment Purchase. The same manager who had tried to place her in used inventory walked her back through the showroom with a different expression, an embarrassed version of respect mixed with a curiosity. And Kane never gave him the speech he probably expected. She signed where they pointed. She asked delivery for Tuesday. She thanked the receptionist by name and left in the same rusted truck she arrived in. The manager stood at the glass door watching her pull onto Route 54, and the only thing he said to the salesman beside him was quiet enough that nobody else heard it. He said, "I read that one wrong." To understand why that wire landed so cleanly, and why the person they had underestimated never once took the bait to explain herself. The story has to go back to 2011, to Pike County, Illinois, when Kane came home to a farm that looked stable from the road and looked uncertain on paper. Marlene Fisher had run the place since Kane's father died, and she had done it in the old way that survives because it works. Legal pads, seed tags stapled into envelopes, and 20 years of ledgers with dates, weather notes, and input receipts clipped into cardboard boxes by crop year. Kane returned from a crop consulting job in Champaign, with more software skills than the farm had ever used, and less confidence than people assumed, because stepping into someone else's operation means inheriting their risks and their reputation in the same week. The farm started with 320 owned acres and 140 leased acres, 460 acres total in 2011, enough to make a living when managed tightly and enough to create problems quickly when managed loosely. The first uncertainty had nothing to do with fertilizer or seed. It was authority. Vendors still called Marlene first. Landlords still asked if she approved changes. Kane could not run a different system while every final decision routed through her mother. Marlene solved that obstacle in one sentence at the end of February, standing by the machine shed where wind cut across open fields. She told Kane, "You carry it now," and she handed over the lease file with signatures and renewal dates. That transfer did not make Kane instantly certain. It made her accountable, which mattered more because accountability forces a clear method. Kane's method started with defining failure before anyone argued about strategy. She wrote one line at the top of her 2011 operating notebook: failed harvest equals whole farm gross margin below $0 per acre. Gross margin meant revenue minus direct crop costs, not family living, not depreciation, a transparent operating threshold that could be tested every year without interpretation games. She kept that definition fixed from 2011 forward. In plain terms, if the crop program produced more cash than it consumed, the harvest was not failed even in ugly years. Early years tested that line faster than she expected. In 2011, she farmed all 460 acres and closed the season at roughly $112 gross margin per acre. Respectable, but not padded. In 2012, drought pressure raised stress across the county, and the operating line climbed to its peak at $118,000 by late July, mostly from timing strain on seed, chemistry, and fuel invoices before grain checks arrived. The obstacle was simple and brutal. Cash timing can make a solvent farm look fragile for 90 days. Kane handled it by tracking weekly payables and harvesting early contracts aggressively. The year still finished above zero at roughly $38 per acre gross margin, thin but alive. That near squeeze sharpened Kane's appetite for precision. She refused flat-rate inputs even when crop prices tempted shortcuts. Her fertility plus biology program averaged $186 per acre, expensive by local gossip standards, and her nitrogen plan held at 165 pounds per acre in split applications, 60 pounds pre-plant, and 105 pounds side dress. Every acre did not receive the same blend because zone maps and tissue tests showed different deficits within the same field. The system cost more upfront and demanded more passes, which created social pressure before it created proof. People noticed the bill long before they noticed the prevented loss. The social pressure became explicit in 2013 when Evan Rourke, the cooperative agronomist, visited with printed recommendations and a confidence shaped by standardization. Evan was not careless. He was competent, busy, and trusted by dozens of operators who needed one clean prescription across many fields. He sat at Kane's shop desk, reviewed her previous 2 years, and told her she was wasting inputs. He proposed a flat $78 per acre cut, immediate, operation-wide, mostly through reduced zone differentials and a simplified nitrogen schedule. His model projected only minor yield risk in ordinary weather. His logic worked cleanly in a normal distribution. Kane asked one question that exposed the fault line. She asked, what happens in the lower organic matter zones if June turns saturated and July turns hot? Evan acknowledged uncertainty, pointed to insurance buffers, and reiterated cost discipline. Kane heard the phrase insurance buffers and marked it in her notebook because insurance pays after failure, while her definition of no failed harvest required avoiding failure in the first place. She declined his recommendation, kept the $186 per acre fertility plus biology program, kept 165 pounds nitrogen, split 60 and 105, and triggered the next obstacle without arguing. The cooperative downgraded her account priority in 2014. The downgrade sounded procedural, not personal. It still had practical consequences. She moved from preferred slotting to secondary scheduling during tight windows, and secondary scheduling in agriculture translates into delayed delivery when weather windows are short. Kane could have reversed course for easier logistics. She instead built an independent testing workflow with Tessa Nguyen, a soil scientist known for blunt reports and no vendor ties. Tessa sampled on a tighter grid, ran tissue checks at key growth stages, and gave Kane uncomfortable data when fields underperformed expectations. This solved supplier dependence and created a new burden. Kane now had to execute a higher precision program without co-op convenience, field by field, pass by pass. From 2013 through 2016, the farm's numbers looked slow to outsiders and decisive to anyone reading the ledger. 2013 closed at about $100 to $46 gross margin per acre. 2014 closed near 129. 2015, the flood year, fell to about 71 and still stayed above zero. 2016 recovered to about 94, and the operating line balance reached zero by year-end, exactly where Kane planned it. Clearing that line did not create celebration scenes. It removed a lever that could move against her in a bad season. The quiet victory was structural, not emotional. The 2015 flood year gave the first hard validation. Heavy spring rain stalled, planting across the county, saturated lower spots, and forced replants that erased margin for operations already stretched on rent and notes. Kane's zone-based fertility looked expensive in March. By August, fields with stronger baseline nutrition and staged nitrogen held together well enough to keep whole farm revenue above insurance guarantee levels. The guarantee mattered because it marked the floor many operations were hitting. Kane stayed above that floor and stayed above zero gross margin, which kept her definition intact under stress, no failed harvests. Joel Baines, her neighbor, entered that same season from a different framework. Joel believed growth through debt because for several years it had rewarded him. He leased aggressively, financed newer equipment to cover acres fast, and carried obligations calibrated for average or better conditions. In 2015, those averages disappeared. Replanting costs rose, yield fell on weaker ground, and his first major loss landed hard enough to force deferred maintenance into the next year. Kane never framed Joel as foolish. Joel was following advice that had worked during favorable weather and prices. The stress year exposed the asymmetry. His upside gains in good years were recoverable. A cascade of obligations in a bad year was not. Kane's choice in that moment shaped the next decade. She could have used 2015 as personal vindication and stayed still. The flood proved her system could survive, so she shifted to selective expansion only where distress pricing created margin of safety. That decision opened the 2017 auction, where Parcel 1, 110 acres, sold at $4,300 per acre, total $473,000. Local chatter called it risky because commodity prices were still uneven. Kane evaluated tile condition, drainage pattern, and soil tests, then bought it. Price mattered less than structure. She entered with enough liquidity to avoid rebuilding the operating line dependency she had just escaped. That purchase changed her fixed cost absorption. More owned acreage spread machinery and labor costs across a wider base, lowering per-acre pressure in average years and improving resilience in hard years. Expansion, funded through stable equity, behaves differently from expansion funded through fragile credit. One increases options in volatile conditions. The other increases commitments that cannot wait for weather to cooperate. Kane's notebooks translated that principle into plain math each winter. She projected cash cost per acre across multiple yield scenarios and rejected any plan that required optimistic assumptions to remain solvent. 2018 did not deliver a dramatic event, which is exactly why it mattered. Farms often get hurt in ordinary years when caution fades and operating creep returns. Kane held the same discipline, maintained equipment instead of replacing for appearance, and banked liquidity while many neighbors chased scale. Joel stabilized somewhat that year, and his partial recovery carried a hidden hazard. It reinforced confidence in a leveraged model right before rates and weather shifted again. Calm seasons can hide structural weakness better than crisis seasons because nothing forces immediate correction. In 2019, two acquisition opportunities arrived close together because tenant turnover and local liquidity stress suppressed bids. Auction Parcel 2 measured 80 acres and sold at $4,850 per acre. Total $388,000. A private seller, facing estate timing pressure, offered 60 adjacent acres at $5,200 per acre. Total $312,000. Kane bought both, adding 140 acres in 1 year. The arithmetic was clear. 2011 started at 320 owned and 140 leased, 460 farmed total. After adding 110 in 2017 and 140 in 2019, owned acres reached 570, leases remained 140, and controlled acreage reached 710 by 2025. Those buys created new operating complexity. More acres meant more timing risk during narrow planting windows, and co-op downgrade status still complicated service priorities until Kane and Tessa rebuilt the calendar around independent sampling and direct lab scheduling. Tessa's role expanded from testing to workflow design. She helped sequence sampling and application by risk zones, so the most failure-sensitive acres received first attention during constrained windows. This turned data into logistics, not just reports, and from that point forward, delayed co-op slotting could inconvenience deliveries without controlling critical pass timing. 2020 delivered the second validation, drought pockets combined with a damaging wind event that flattened vulnerable sections across parts of the county. Kane still avoided whole farm loss. Some fields underperformed. Some lodged badly. The program held enough consistency across zones to keep aggregate gross margin above zero again, preserving her no-failed harvest record under a different stress profile than 2015. Two distinct stress years had now tested the same philosophy. Flood and saturation pressure first, drought and wind second. Surviving one crisis can be luck. Surviving both points toward structure. Joel's operation entered 2021 carrying unresolved strain from prior years plus rising costs. Variable rates moved fast, input prices climbed, and margin squeeze hit leveraged structures hardest because fixed obligations stayed fixed while revenue uncertainty widened. Joel had equipment and rent commitments built in lower rate assumptions. As rates reset, interest expense expanded at the same time fertilizer and fuel bills rose and liquidity tightened. He tried to hold all his leased ground through harvest, working longer hours with fewer repair dollars, knowing every breakdown might decide which landlord renewed and which did not. The rate shock did not arrive as one dramatic letter. It arrived as monthly statements that gradually removed his room to maneuver. By late 2021, Joel had to liquidate key leases and let acreage go. The loss was visible in small moments, extra bins left empty, one hired hand not called back, rented fields harvested by someone else's crew. Kane watched this without triumph because she had seen the same pattern swallow good operators across different years and different personalities. The strategy failed under stress, not the person. Joel still knew agronomy, logistics, and machinery better than many owners with cleaner balance sheets. That recognition opened a practical path. Kane offered Joel a paid farm manager role as her acreage expanded and operational complexity increased. The job gave him stable salary, seasonal bonus tied to operational targets, and predictable hours outside peak windows for family life. He had nearly lost to debt panic. Joel accepted after 1 week, not because pride vanished, because structure returned. His expertise now worked inside a system that could absorb volatility. The obstacle resolved was dignity. He needed a role that preserved competence rather than framing him as a cautionary tale. Reed Holloway had tracked Kane's file for years with formal risk committee caution. He respected clean books and still kept distance because agricultural cycles can reverse quickly. Kane's cleared operating line by end of 2016, stable stress year margins, and disciplined acquisitions changed his internal classification slowly. He shifted from lender of last resort posture to relationship banking, still cautious, still methodical. By 2023, after repeated liquidity proofs and no operating line dependence, Reed moved her profile to the bank's internal private client status, reflecting balance sheet strength more than personality familiarity. Kane did not ask for the label. The bank adjusted to the arithmetic already present. Evan Rourke's arc moved quieter. His 2013 recommendation had been rational inside a broad model, and Kane's records eventually forced nuance into that model. In stress years, her supposedly expensive program outperformed his standard prescription on downside protection, especially in low testing zones that collapsed first under compounded weather pressure. Evan did not transform overnight into her disciple. He met her in 2022 at a county meeting, asked to review anonymized stress year data, and later admitted openly that her records beat his assumptions when conditions got ugly. That admission mattered because it corrected a professional blind spot without turning either person into a villain. The social underestimation lingered anyway. Old trucks still attract quick judgments. Quiet operators still get read as cash constrained. Which brings the story back to December 2023 at the dealership, where years of misread appearances met one wire transfer. Kane had gone in for a combine and header package priced at $612,000 cash, and the sales team had nudged her toward used inventory based on signals that looked obvious to them: the truck, the coat, the absence of performative urgency. She did not correct them verbally. She requested numbers, called Reed, wired funds, and signed. Arithmetic handled the argument in under 10 minutes. That moment circulated fast through local farm networks because reversals travel farther than explanations. People who had treated Kane as tightly stretched reran their assumptions. Some felt embarrassed. Some felt relieved that discipline could still win in a culture saturated with financed optics. Kane offered no commentary when calls came in asking how she had done it. She gave short answers only when practical details helped someone make a decision. Her restraint kept the focus on method rather than personality, and method was the part that could transfer to other farms. By 2024, she and Tessa translated that transfer into a formal field school, part classroom, part field walk, built for beginning farmers who had technical ability and weak working capital. Kane funded the program's hard costs and refused sponsorship terms that required steering participants toward bundled input packages. She added paid soil testing support because data without affordability excludes the people who need it. This solved a recurring bottleneck she had seen for years. Younger operators were asked to make precision decisions using guest-level information because testing budgets were the first thing cut when cash got tight. The grant structure stayed specific. Beginning farmer grant pool totaled $240,000, distributed as 12 grants of $20,000 each across 2024 and 2025. Funds could cover variable rate fertility correction, split application logistics, drainage fixes, or working capital buffer tied to documented crop plans. Kane required one condition. Recipients had to keep transparent field-level records and share anonymized results at winter sessions so everyone could see what succeeded and what failed without branding pressure. Tessa ran the technical review. Joel handled machinery planning modules, translating precision goals into past timing that real crews could execute. Specific recipients made the impact concrete. A beginning operator named Abby Soto used $20,000 to map and correct severe potassium variability on 92 rented acres and moved from negative stress year projections to a positive operating margin the following season. Marcus Lee used his grant for split nitrogen logistics and tissue sampling on 140 acres, reducing late-season burn and preserving yield during a dry finish. Elena Price directed funds into paid grid sampling and targeted lime on acidic patches that had been dragging her soybean performance for years. None of these projects guaranteed high profits. They reduced collapse risk, which was Kane's original target from 2011 onward. As results accumulated, the field school grew from 20 participants to 51 in 18 months. Kane kept enrollment capped each season because uncontrolled growth would dilute coaching quality and recreate the one-size problem she had spent a decade resisting. She and Tessa built a simple multiplier analysis from participant records. The first 12 grants, totaling $240,000, correlated with estimated avoided negative margins and retained working capital of roughly $690,000 across 2 stress-affected seasons among recipients. Estimates stayed conservative and transparently labeled because Kane disliked inflated impact claims as much as she disliked glossy equipment financing brochures. Marlene watched this phase from a different life. She had moved to town, transferred full management authority to Kane, and finally stopped carrying field-level decision weight in her own body. Retirement for her did not mean disengagement. She still attended one winter session each year, sat in the back, and listened while young operators argued about side dress timing and tissue thresholds. Watching Kane teach through records rather than lectures gave Marlene a quiet closure. The uncertainty that defined 2011 had resolved into a stable operating culture that did not depend on one person's memory. Reed's relationship with Kane settled into practical trust. Private client status did not change her lifestyle or truck choice. It changed transaction speed when large opportunities appeared and reduced friction on treasury tools that supported seasonal cash management. He still reviewed her projections with formal discipline. She still showed up with notebooks that tied every assumption to field-level evidence. That rhythm, cautious banker and stubborn operator meeting at the same numbers, replaced the old dynamic where banks interpreted farmers through collateral alone. Data quality became collateral of its own. Evans' resolution came in public in early 2025 at a county agronomy panel. He presented updated recommendations that included stress year adjustment bans and credited local operator data for forcing revisions, Kane's records among them. He did not perform a dramatic apology. He acknowledged that his 2013 framework undervalued downside protection in heterogeneous fields and said it plainly to a room that remembered his earlier certainty. Professional humility arrived slowly and arrived fully enough to matter. Kane thanked him afterward, short and direct, because corrected models help everyone, including people who never liked her choices. Joel's resolution was visible at Harvest 2025. The same operator whose leverage had cost him leases in 2021 now ran Kane's logistics plan across 710 controlled acres with fewer emergency repairs than the farm had seen in years, and his compensation package gave him predictable income plus a performance bonus linked to fuel efficiency, downtime reduction, and completion timing across high-risk zones. He no longer carried lease panic into winter. His kids saw him at dinner in October for the first time in years. The human cost of his earlier leverage did not disappear, the lost leases did not return, yet his competence found a stable home, and his family regained routine. Kane's own numbers by 2025 closed the argument with the same quiet force as that dealership wire. Controlled acreage reached 710, composed of 570 owned acres, and the same 140 leased acres from the original structure. Net worth reached $4,680,000, built through debt restraint, distressed acquisitions, steady margins, and a refusal to purchase status. She remained debt-free at the ending point, with expansion of mentorship funding already planned from operating surplus and conservative reserves. People who wanted a dramatic reveal speech never got one. They got audited arithmetic across 14 crop years. The deeper reversal in this story never sat in one payment or one panel quote. It sat in the long correction of a cultural assumption. Visible spending equals strength. Visible frugality equals weakness. Kane looked undercapitalized to people reading surface signals. Her actual position was stronger because she treated cash flow volatility as the central problem and designed everything around surviving bad years without surrendering control. That framework did not make her rich overnight. It made her hard to break. And over time, hard to break became hard to ignore. Every major beat in her path solved a specific hesitation that had blocked the next move. Marlene transferred authority, which allowed one coherent management method. Evan's challenge forced a clear philosophical commitment instead of half measures. Co-op downgrade removed convenience and pushed independent testing discipline with Tessa. The 2015 flood proved the expensive-looking program was not waste under stress, which justified selective expansion. Joel's losses translated abstract leverage risk into human stakes, deepening Kane's caution without contempt. Distressed purchases in 2017 and 2019 solved scale constraints on her terms. 2021 rate shock separated fragile and resilient structures in plain view. 2023 dealership misread resolved appearance versus reality with one wire. The grants converted private resilience into shared capacity. The year-by-year ledger still tells the cleanest version. 2011, 460 acres farmed, gross margin positive. 2012, operating line peaks at $118,000 and closes with harvest recovery above zero. 2013, pressure to cut $78 per acre rejected. 2014, co-op downgrade accepted, independent workflow built. 2015, flood stress, whole farm margin stays positive and above insurance guarantee. 2016, operating line balance reaches zero by year end. 2017, 110 acres bought at $4,300 per acre. 2019, 80 acres bought at $4,850 and 60 acres bought at $5,200. 2020, drought pockets and wind, no whole farm loss. 2021, rate shock forces leveraged lease exits. 2023, 612,000 cash combine package wired. 2024 and 2025, 240,000 grant pool deployed in 12 grants of 20,000 each. People still asked Kane why she kept driving the old truck after the 2023 purchase, and she still answered with a sentence that closed the topic. She said, "Trucks do not produce yield." The answer sounded almost funny because it was so plain. and it carried the whole philosophy without turning into performance. Money served function first, option second, ego never. Once that hierarchy is set, many decisions become easy, and easy decisions repeated for 14 years can produce a balance sheet that looks improbable to people trained to recognize only visible prosperity. By late 2025, the field school's waiting list exceeded available slots, so Kane and Tessa added a second cohort focused on record discipline for operators under 3 years in business. Reed supported the expansion with treasury tools and no pressure to monetize the program through sponsorship. Joel took lead on equipment economics sessions, showing young farmers how maintenance planning can postpone unnecessary replacement by years when done proactively. Evan sent updated stress year recommendation templates to every participant, now including caution flags he once considered unnecessary. Marlene attended opening day and left before lunch, satisfied the farm could outlive every one of them in good shape. No character in this story exits in triumph theater. They exit in reality. Kane ends debt-free, still precise, still uninterested in signaling wealth. Evan ends corrected and more useful to the county than he was in 2013. Marlene ends retired in town with management fully transferred and no loose legal control. Joel ends employed in a role that matches his skill and protects his household from the leverage shocks that once stripped his rented ground. Tessa ends co-running a field school built on the independent workflow that started after the co-op downgrade. Reed ends with a client he once treated as marginal, now sitting in private client status because numbers left no room for doubt. The phrase "no failed harvest" can sound like bravado until the definition is stated and defended through bad years. Kane's definition never moved. Whole farm gross margin below 0 per acre marked failure. Anything above 0 meant survival with capacity to continue. She never hit that negative line, not in flood, not in drought pockets and wind, not through rate shock years when peers with heavier leverage lost leases or operations entirely. Survival did not always look pretty. Some years were thin and tense. Thin and tense above 0 still compounds. Collapse does not. In Pike County, stories like this often get simplified into personality myths. Stubborn woman proves everyone wrong, banker shocked, salesman humbled. The arithmetic carries a less theatrical lesson. Kane built a framework that priced downside risk honestly, accepted higher short-term input cost where data justified it, refused dependence on convenient suppliers when convenience threatened execution quality, and treated expansion as optional until distress pricing created favorable entries. The method looked slow in good years and looked inevitable in hard years. That trade-off is the entire point. A decade earlier, when Evan told her she was wasting inputs, Kane could have argued for hours and changed nothing. She chose a longer route. Keep records, keep margins above 0, keep ownership rising, keep debt exposure falling, and let stress years arbitrate the argument. By the time she wired $600 to $12,000 at the dealership, the verdict had already been written across 14 harvests. The wire only made it visible to people who had not been watching the right numbers. At sunset in October 2025, Kane stood with Tessa and Joel at the edge of a field that had once tested too low in 2 separate zones to hold yield under pressure. The corrected fertility bands were visible in the stand, not dramatic, just even enough to avoid collapse. A group of beginning farmers walked the rows asking practical questions about sample depth, timing, and cash constraints, and Kane answered with short sentences and references to notebooks, never with speeches. She had become what her mother quietly hoped for in 2011, an operator whose discipline could be taught without being worshipped. The farm closed another season above zero, another year with no failed harvest, and the numbers, as usual, spoke for themselves.